I was 51 years old before I learned that the hardest thing a man can do with a gun is leave it in the holster. And I learned it in a High Plains town called Coldwater, on the porch of a forge that wasn't mine, with a 6-year-old girl's hand twisted into the back of my shirt. But that comes later. Let me tell it the way it came to me, slow at first and then all at once, the way trouble always arrives if you've lived long enough to know its footsteps. I rode into Coldwater on a borrowed-looking November day, the sky the color of a dropped knife, and the wind coming flat off the Tallgrass Range with nothing to stop it for 100 miles. My horse was a good roan gone hollow in the flank from too many days of grass and not enough grain, and I had $11, a rifle I hadn't fired in 2 years, and a name I hadn't said out loud in longer than that. The Sablon River ran low and gray past the edge of town, and the town itself was the kind of place that had decided to exist on the strength of cattle and a spring and not much else. A single street of false fronts, a church with a bent steeple, a saloon called the Drover's Rest with its sign repainted so many times the words had gone soft, and at the far end, where the street gave up and turned into a wagon track, a forge. I heard it before I saw it. That steady ring of iron on iron, 2 beats and a rest, 2 beats and a rest, the oldest music there is. I'd been hearing that sound my whole life in one town or another, and it had always meant the same thing to me. That here was a place where a man could get work for his hands and ask no questions and have none asked, where the heat of the fire burned the day down to something simple. I turned the roan toward it the way a cold man turns toward a window with a light in it. The forge sat low and broad under a shake roof gone silver with weather, a stone chimney shouldering up out of it, and a haze of charcoal smoke leaning sideways in the wind. There was a livery barn behind it and a corral, and beyond the corral, a stretch of bottomland grass running down to the river, the kind of grass that stays green a month longer than the range around it because there's water under it. Good land. The best I'd seen since I'd crossed the river 2 days back. A man notices land like that the way he notices a pretty woman or a loaded gun, without meaning to, out of an old animal habit. I expected to find a smith at the anvil, a big man most likely, with arms like fence posts and a leather apron scorched black down the front. What I found instead was a woman. She had her back half to me, working a piece of bar stocked down to a wagon tire, and she was good at it. I could see that right off. She didn't waste a stroke. She held the iron the way you hold something you respect, turning it a quarter at a time, reading the color of it, and her hammer came down in that same patient two-end arrest I'd heard from the road. She wore a man's wool shirt with the sleeves shoved up and a leather apron and her dark hair tied back hard, and there was soot on her jaw and a sheen of sweat on her forehead even in that cold. She was not a big woman. She was making up the difference with everything she had, and you could see the cost of it in the set of her shoulders. I sat the roan a moment and didn't say anything, because there's a thing you don't do, which is come up on someone working hot iron and startle them. So I waited until she'd set the piece back in the fire and reached for the bellows, and then I said, "Looking for a smith, or work if there's any." She turned around fast, the way a person turns when they've learned to. Her hand came halfway to the hammer she'd laid on the anvil before she stopped it. She had a strong, plain, weathered face, brown eyes that took the measure of me in about a second and a half, and she was younger than her hands and her shoulders had let me guess, 30 maybe, not more. "The smith dead," she said. It came out flat, no pity asked for and none in it. I've heard 100 ways of saying a man's gone, and that was the way of someone who'd worn the news down smooth from carrying it. "I'm sorry to hear it," I said, and meant it the ordinary amount. "You're sorry the same as everyone." She wiped her wrist across her forehead and left a fresh smear of black there. "There's no work. I can't pay a hand." I looked past her at the livery, at the wagon tire half done at the order of the place, and it was orderly, every tool on its peg, the woodpile squared, the charcoal banked, and I looked at the thing I'd seen the second I rode up, which was that there was too much here for one pair of arms. 2 horses needed shoeing in the corral by the look of their feet. The barn roof had a corner that wanted mending before the snow. The wagon she was building tires for was up on blocks with one wheel off, and a man's work, half a dozen jobs of it, sat waiting all around her like a debt. "I'll work for the barn and a meal," I said. "A week. You don't owe me past what you think it was worth at the end of it." She studied me. "Out there, you learn to read a stranger fast because the cost of reading him wrong is high," and I let her read me. I'm not a big man either, never was, middling height, gone gray at the temples by then, a face that had been weathered into something that didn't give much away, which is a thing I'd worked at. I had good hands and I kept them where she could see them. "You smith," she said. "Some I can do plain work. Shoes, tires, hardware. I won't ruin your good steel." "Why?" It wasn't quite a question. She wanted to know why a man would work for a barn and a meal, and that was a fair thing to want to know, because in my experience men who'll work for nothing usually have a reason, and the reason is usually bad. "Because I'm broke and it's coming on winter," I said, "and because that's a good fire and I'm cold." That was true, and it was simple, and I'd learned that the truth told plain will carry you past suspicion further than any lie. She looked at me a while longer. Then she said, "There's a stall in the barn. You sleep there, not in the house. You touch nothing of mine I don't hand you. You eat at the back step, not at my table." She said it like a woman laying down fence line, and I respected her for every inch of it. "Fair," I said. "My name's Hannah Doyle," she said. "This was my husband's forge. It's mine now." The way she said "it's mine now," there was iron in it hotter than anything in her fire. I'd find out before long just how much that little sentence had cost her, and how much it was going to. "Eli," I said. I didn't give her the rest. The rest I'd buried 2 years back in a town 300 miles south, under a different sky, and I had no intention of digging it up. "I'll tell you about the work first, because the work is where I came to know her, and where I came to know the town, and it's the work that's the spine of all of it." She was a better smith than I was, and she didn't lord it. She'd married Samuel Doyle at 19 and learned the trade at his elbow for 10 years, and when he died, I got the shape of it slow, over days. She'd simply tied on the apron and kept the fire lit, because the fire going out meant the place was dead, and the place being dead meant Lyle won. And I didn't know yet who Lyle was, but I learned to hear the change in her voice when his name came up. A kind of tightening, like a man bracing for a blow he can't dodge. We fell into a rhythm. I took the brute work off her, the shoeing, the heavy hardware, the barn roof, hauling charcoal, and she did the fine work, the tool steel and the things that needed a true eye. We didn't talk much those first days. She'd hand me a job and I'd do it, and she'd look it over and either nod or tell me where I'd gone short, and that was the whole of it. There was a girl, too, Effie. 6 years old, all elbows and questions. Samuel Doyle's daughter, and the spit of her mother around the eyes. And she had no notion at all that she was supposed to be wary of me. By the third day she was perched on the woodpile telling me the names of every horse that had ever come through and which ones bit. And Hannah let her, watching from the forge with that hard wariness softening just at the edges, the way ice goes at the rim of a trough before the middle ever knows. I learned the trouble the way you learn weather, by the signs before the storm. The first sign was the customers. There weren't enough of them. A forge in a cattle town ought to never be quiet, and hours went quiet for whole afternoons. The second sign was the ones who did come. They came at odd hours, early or near dark, and they came looking over their shoulders, and they paid quick and left quicker, like men buying liquor in a dry county. The third sign was the fences. On my 5th morning, I rode the bottomland to check the stock. Hannah ran a dozen head on the river grass. Her own small herd, the start of something, and I found the wire down in 3 places, and the cattle scattered halfway to the Sablon ford. Cut wire, not broke. Cut clean with a tool and the posts pulled. I spent the morning gathering the herd and the afternoon restringing wire, and when I came in at dark Hannah was on the porch with a lamp, waiting, and she looked at my face and said, "Cut." "Cut," I said. She didn't cuss. She didn't cry. She set the lamp down and looked off across the dark toward the river, and Effie came and leaned on her leg, and after a while she said, in a low, flat voice, not really to me, "Third time this month." "Who?" I said. She looked at me then, and I think she was deciding something, whether I was a man who'd ask who and then ride on, the way everybody else in Coldwater had decided to ride on, or whether the asking meant anything. I don't know what she saw, but she sat down on the step and she told me plain, the way she did everything. Samuel Doyle had come to Coldwater 11 years back with his brother Lyle, the two of them young and broke and full of plans the way young men are. Samuel was the worker. He'd taken the forge in the bottomland, proved it up honest, filed the deed, dug the spring out by hand, married Hannah, built the place stone by stone. Lyle was the talker. He'd gone into cattle and into the saloon and into whatever paid without sweat, and over the years he'd done well at it, the way talkers sometimes do, and he'd bought up range and bought up men and bought up, somewhere along the line, the marshal, a soft, frightened man named Pell who wore his star like an apology. And then Samuel had died. A horse had gone over backward on him in the corral, a green horse he was breaking to harness, and it had crushed him against the rail, and he'd lived 3 days and then he hadn't. An accident. Just an accident, the kind that takes good men on the frontier every season. But within a month of the burying, Lyle Doyle had come to his brother's widow with a paper and a smile, and the paper said, Lyle said it said, that the bottom land and the forge had been a partnership between the brothers, and that with Samuel gone, Lyle's share fell due, and that the simplest thing, the kindest thing, would be for Hannah to sell out to him and take the money and go back east where a woman alone had people. There was no partnership, Hannah said. Sam built this himself. I watched him do it. The deed's in my name now, free and clear, and Lyle knows it, and the paper's a lie, and he knows that too. He doesn't think the paper has to be true. He thinks it only has to be heavier than I am. She was quiet a moment. He's wrong about that, she said. But I'd seen the cut wire, and I'd seen the empty afternoons, and I'd seen the men coming to the forge like thieves, and I understood the shape of it. Lyle Doyle wasn't going to take the land with a paper. He was going to take it with weight, with every small cruelty a man with money and a tame marshal, and a town too scared to look can lay on a woman alone until the simple act of staying becomes more than she can bear. Cut her fences. Scatter her stock. Lean on her customers so the forge goes quiet and the money runs out. Let the winter do part of the work, and when she's worn down past holding, come back with the paper and the smile, and this time she signs, because signing is the only door left open. It's a patient kind of cruelty. It doesn't leave a mark a marshal would have to see. And it works, more often than not, and that's the worst of it, that it works, that towns let it work, that 100 Hannahs have signed 100 lying papers because no one would stand up beside them and say the one word that breaks it. I knew that kind of cruelty very well. I had, in another life, been a tool of it. That's the part I'd buried, and I'll tell you the shape of it now because you can't understand what I did later if you don't know what I'd been. I had been a shootist. A regulator, they called it polite, when cattle money hired guns to settle range the way range got settled in those years, by deciding who was too small or too poor or too in the way to keep what they had, and then making it so. I'd ridden for big outfits against little ones. I'd stood in streets like Coldwater's Main Street and worn a gun the way Lyle's men wore theirs, and I'd been good at it, God forgive me, good enough that there'd been a name attached to me, a name I won't write here even now, a name that had made small ranchers sell out and clear off at the mere word that I'd been hired, because they knew what came after. I'd done it for money, and I'd done it because a young man with a fast hand mistakes fear for respect, and the mistake feels fine for a long time. And then one gray morning in a town down south, I'd stood in a street like that, and faced down a man who had a wife and a half-grown boy and a quarter section he wouldn't leave. And the man had been no shootist at all, just stubborn and scared and right. And he'd gone for his gun because he had nothing left to do, and I'd killed him in front of his boy. And the boy had not run. The boy had walked out into that street and knelt by his father in the dust and looked up at me, and there had been no fear in his face at all, just a kind of terrible understanding, like he'd suddenly seen the whole machine of the world and his place in it and mine. I dropped the gun, right there in the street. I'd taken off the rig and let it lie in the dust by the dead man, and I'd gotten on my horse and ridden out, and I'd never picked it up again. And I'd spent 2 years drifting north working forges and fences and anything that asked my hands and not my name, trying to become an everyday man, a man like any other, a man you'd hire to mend your wire and never look at twice. I told myself I'd left it behind. You can't leave it behind. You can only set it down. There's a difference, and Coldwater taught me what it was. The harassment got worse as the cold came on, the way Lyle had surely planned. He was patient. I never once saw him do a thing with his own hands. He didn't have to. He had Boyd Cruz. Cruz was his foreman, and he was the kind of man I'd known too many of, big, easy, smiling, with flat eyes that smiled separately from his mouth. A man who enjoyed his work, and the work was hurting people who couldn't hurt back. He had 3 or 4 hands who rode with him and did what he pointed at. They took to drifting past the forge of an evening, slow, looking it over, saying nothing, the way men do when the looking is the message. They'd water their horses at Hannah's trough without asking and grin at her while they did it. One night someone fired the haystack behind the barn, and we got it beat out before it spread to the buildings. But it was a near thing, and Effie had screamed and screamed at the flames in the dark, and that was a sound I have not forgotten. I rode in to see Marshal Pell about the hay. He was a small man going to fat, with a kind, weak, miserable face, and he sat behind his desk and would not look at me. "No proof who set it," he said. "Could have been a spark. She runs a forge." "It was set," I said. "There was coal oil on the ground." "You a deputy now?" He tried for hard, and it came out frightened. "You're a drifter," she took on. "You watch yourself, mister. Men have asked about you." He looked up then, just once, and there was something in it that might have been a warning meant kindly. "Whatever you're running from, this isn't your fight. Take your wages and ride before the snow closes the pass. That's the best word I've got for you. Men have asked about you." I felt that go through me like cold water. Somebody in Coldwater had taken an interest in the widow's new hand. Somebody was wondering who I was. And there was only one way that wondering ends, if a man wonders hard enough and has the money to send letters and wait for answers. I rode back to the forge, and I'll tell you the truth. I packed my war bag that night. I sat on the cot in the barn stall with the bag in my lap, and I told myself all the sensible things. That it wasn't my fight. That I was a man trying to disappear, and standing up in a town that was watching me was the surest way to be found. That Hannah Doyle was a stranger who let me eat on her back step. That I'd buried the gun for a reason, and the reason held. I had $11 when I came, and I had a few more now, and the pass wasn't closed yet, and a man could be 100 miles gone by the time it mattered. And then through the barn wall I heard Effie crying. Not the screaming from the fire, a small, tired, going-to-sleep crying, the kind a child does when the day has had more fear in it than a child can hold. And I heard Hannah's voice low under it. Not the words, just the tune of it. The sound a mother makes that means I'm here, nothing's going to get you. And I sat there in the dark with my bag in my lap, and I understood that Hannah Doyle was making a promise to that child that she did not, by herself, alone, against Lyle Doyle and his money and his bought marshal and his smiling foreman, have any way on earth to keep. I'd made promises I couldn't keep. To that boy in the street, in a manner of speaking, every man I'd run off his land had been somebody's promise broken. I'd spent 2 years trying to become a man who didn't break them. And here was the test of it, sitting in my lap in a canvas bag, and I'd been about to fail it the easy way, the quiet way, the way that leaves no mark. I unpacked the bag. I did not that night take out the gun. The gun was wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom, and I left it there. But I unpacked the rest, and I lay down, and I decided to stay, and I want to be plain that the decision had nothing noble in it. I was just a man who'd spent his life on the wrong side of that street, and I had been handed, late and undeserved, a chance to stand on the other side of it, and I found I could not ride away from that. Not again. Not with that crying coming through the wall. I started staying close after that. I shod horses in the open where the street could see me. I mended the wire as fast as they cut it, and I dug the posts deeper. When Cruz and his men drifted by of an evening, I came out of the forge and stood in the doorway with my arms folded and watched them the way they watched the house, and I let them see that the watching went both ways now. I didn't wear a gun. That was important to me, though I couldn't have told you exactly why yet. I stood in that doorway in a leather apron with my bare hands hanging, and I watched them, and they didn't quite know what to make of a man who'd stand up to them with nothing on his hip, and it slowed them, that not knowing, for a while. Hannah didn't thank me. That wasn't her way, and I'm glad of it now. What she did was harder and meant more. She started talking to me. In the evenings, with the work done and Effie asleep, she'd sit on the porch step. I still ate at the back. She still kept her fences up, and I respected that, but she'd talk across the dark to where I sat on the chopping block. And she told me about Samuel, and about the land, about how Sam had found the spring by watching where the deer came at dusk. About the first winter when they'd had nothing and he'd traded shoeing for a milk cow, and they'd lived on milk and cornmeal till spring. About how he'd laughed. Which she said was the thing she missed past all the rest, that he'd been a man who laughed easy, and now the place was so quiet. People think a woman alone wants saving, she said one night. Lyle thinks it. He thinks if he makes it hard enough I'll be grateful for the door he leaves open. But I don't want saving, Eli. I want to be let alone to keep what's mine. This land is Effie's. Sam built it for her. I'd burn it to the ground myself before I'd hand it to the man who's trying to fright a child out of her own home. She was quiet, and then she said, lower, I'm not as strong as I make out. Some nights I'm not strong at all, but I'm strong enough not to sign. That much I've got. You've got more than that, I said. You've got a smith better than me and a herd you built and a deed that's true. He's the one with the lie. A lie's heavy to carry. He'll tire of it before you tire of the truth. Will he, she said. It wasn't hope. She was too clear-eyed for hope, but it wasn't surrender either. He will if the carrying costs him something, I said. Right now it costs him nothing. That's the only thing wants changing. She looked at me a long moment across the dark. And how does it come to cost him something? I didn't answer that. I didn't have an answer yet that I was willing to say out loud, because the only answers I'd ever known from men like Lyle Doyle were answers I'd sworn off. And I was afraid that under the leather apron and the bare hands I was still the man who knew those answers, and that the town would teach me I'd never set the gun down at all, only laid it within reach. The thing that brought it to a head was Effie. It was a Saturday market day, the one day the town filled up, drovers in for supplies and ranch families in their wagons. The street crowded enough that Hannah judged it safe to take Effie in for cloth and sugar, and the small things a household needs that don't come from a forge. She asked me to come, not for protection. She'd never have put it that way, but to load the wagon and hold the horses, and I went, and I'm glad past saying that I did. We were at the mercantile, Hannah inside, Effie out front with me by the wagon, and the girl was telling me about a dog she'd seen, when Boyd Cruz came up the boardwalk with 2 of his men, and he'd been drinking, you could see it, the smiling gone loose and mean. And he stopped and he looked at Effie, at a 6-year-old child, eating a peppermint Hannah had given her, and he said loud for the street to hear, "There's the little Doyle, living on stole land. You know your ma's a thief, girl. Living on what ain't hers." The street went quiet the way a street does. People looked and then looked away, which is the particular sin of frightened towns, and Effie pressed back against my leg, and her hand came up and twisted into the back of my shirt, and she looked up at Cruz with her chin shaking, trying so hard to be brave, 6 years old and trying to be brave, and Cruz stepped down off the boardwalk toward her grinning, and his 2 men spread out a little the way men do who mean for there to be no help. And I felt the whole of my old life rise up in me cold and clear and certain, the gun life, the street life, the thing I was good at, And I knew exactly how to make Boyd Cruz stop. And it lived in 3 pounds of oiled steel wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a bag in a barn a quarter-mile off. And I had a knife on my belt in good hands, and I could have ended him where he stood, and part of me wanted to so bad my jaw ached with it. And Effie's hand was twisted in my shirt, and I thought of the boy in the street kneeling by his father. I set Effie behind me, gentle, both hands on her shoulders, and moved her behind me so my body was between her and Cruz, and I stepped forward off the wagon, and I had nothing on my hip and nothing in my hands, and I stood in front of Boyd Cruz the way I had once stood in front of frightened men with everything on my hip, only turned all the way around, and I said one word. Enough. It came out quiet. I'd learned long ago that quiet carries further than loud when a street has gone still to listen. Cruz stopped. He looked at me, at the empty hip, the bare hands, the leather apron, and the smile came back because he thought he understood me, thought I was a sodbuster, a hired man, a nobody who'd talked himself into a corner. "Or what?" he said. "You ain't even healed, old man. What are you going to?" "You're frightening a child," I said, still quiet, "in front of 40 people who'll remember it. And you're doing it because a man pays you to, and the man pays you because he hasn't got the spine to do his own frightening. You go back and you tell Lyle Doyle that the widow's hand says enough. The wire stays up. The hay stays unfired. The girl gets left be. Whatever he's after, he comes and gets it in the daylight with the law and a true paper like a man, or he doesn't get it at all." I let that sit. Then I said, and I made sure the street heard it, "I've stood in a lot of streets, friend. I know how they end. This one's not going to end the way you're used to. You take that back to him. There's a thing that happens sometimes when a man who's been on the killing side of it stands on the protecting side and means it down to the bone. It comes off you. I don't know how else to say it." Boyd Cruz had braced people his whole life, and he knew the feel of a man who'll fold, and I wasn't folding. And there was something under my quiet he couldn't place and didn't like. And the street was watching, 40 witnesses, and a drunk man in front of witnesses with no clean way to make good on his threat is a man looking for the door. He blustered. He said something I won't repeat about Hannah that I made myself not answer because answering was the trap. And then he and his men went on up the street, slower than they'd come, and the crowd let out its breath, and somewhere a woman said, not quietly, "About time somebody did," and an old drover spat and said, "Stole land, my eye." Sam Doyle dug that spring with these eyes watching. And just like that, the thing Lyle had been counting on, the silence, the looking away, the town's agreement not to see, cracked right down the middle on a Saturday morning over a peppermint and a frightened child. Hannah had come out onto the boardwalk somewhere in the middle of it. She stood in the mercantile doorway with cloth in her arms, and she'd heard most of it, and she was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her, not the wariness, not the iron, something open and frightened and fierce all at once. She'd heard me say I've stood in a lot of streets. She'd heard what was under it. She didn't say anything there in front of the town. But that night on the porch she said, "Who were you, Eli?" Not who are you, who were you, she'd understood that much. So I told her, all of it. The regulating, the outfits, the name I won't say, the small ranchers run off, the morning in the southern town, and the man and the boy and the gun left in the dust. I told it flat, and I left nothing soft in it, because she'd let me work her fire and sit by her child, and she had a right to the whole ugly truth of the man she'd taken in, and if she sent me down the road for it, that was her right too, and a fair price. I told her, and I waited. She was quiet a long time, the lamp guttered. Then she said, "Today in the street, you weren't wearing it." "No. You wanted to be." "More than I've wanted anything in 2 years," I said. I knew exactly how to stop him. The old way, it's still in me. I don't think it ever leaves. I stood there and I wanted it, and I put your girl behind me instead. My voice did something I didn't plan. "That's the only kind of man I know how to be now, Hannah. Not a good one. Just one who's learned what the gun costs and won't pay it again. If that's not enough for you, I'll ride at first light and no hard feelings. But I won't pick it back up, not even for this, not even for him. You'd want a different man for that, and I'm not him anymore." She got up off the step. She came across the yard to the chopping block where I sat, crossed her own fence line for the first time, and she stood in front of me and she said, "Sam laughed easy. I told you that. He was the best man I ever knew, and he never had a hard day's worth of darkness in him." She looked down at me. "I don't need another Sam. I had Sam. What I need," and her voice caught, and she pushed through it the way she pushed through everything. "What I need is somebody who knows exactly how to do the worst thing and chooses the hard way instead, with my girl's hand in his shirt and the whole town watching. That's not a lesser man, Eli. I've been thinking all day it might be the only kind worth the name." I didn't have words for that. I'm not sure there are words for being told, by the one person you'd let yourself care about, that the worst thing you ever did has somehow been spent down into the thing that lets you stand. She put her hand on my shoulder, just that, just her hand, soot still under the nails of it. And we stayed like that a while in the cold with the lamp going down, and that was the whole of it that night, and it was everything. The reckoning came quick after that, the way it does once a town finds its spine. The Saturday in the street had loosened tongues. People who'd seen Sam Doyle dig that spring with their own eyes got tired of pretending they hadn't. The old drover who'd spat in the dust turned out to be a man named Cobb who'd freighted for Sam in the early years and had once helped him pull the deed papers to the county seat himself. And Cobb got to talking, and the talk got to the circuit judge who came through Coldwater twice a year and happened to be due. And it came out, because once people will say what they saw, it always comes out, that the partnership paper Lyle Doyle carried had Sam's signature on it, dated a month after Sam was already 3 days in the ground. A month after. Lyle had been too greedy or too lazy to even fake the date right, because he'd never expected anyone to look. He'd been counting on weight, not truth. He'd been counting on Hannah signing before any judge ever saw the thing. And now the judge was coming and the town was talking, and the paper was a forgery a child could see through. And forgery is a hanging adjacent business even on the high plains. And all at once it was Lyle Doyle carrying something heavier than Hannah Doyle had ever been. He made one last play. Of course he did. Men like Lyle always have one more, and the last one is always the ugliest because it's made of fear. He came to the forge himself. First time I'd laid eyes on him, and he was a softer, sleeker version of his dead brother's bones, a handsome man gone puffy around a hard, small core, and he had Boyd Cruz and 3 men with him, and they rode in at dusk with the clear intent of finishing it before the judge ever sat. Burn the place, most likely, run the stock for good, leave a widow with nothing to bring to any court, make the truth not matter by making sure there was nothing left to be true about. But the town had spine now, and word travels, and we weren't alone. When Lyle and his men rode up to the forge, they found me standing in the door of it in the apron, bare-handed, the same as always. And behind me in the dark of the forge stood Cobb the freighter with a shotgun, and the mercantile owner, and 2 of the ranch families who'd been at the market, and the blacksmith from the next town over who'd known Sam. 8 or 9 plain people who decided, finally, that they'd rather stand in a doorway than look away one more time. And Hannah stood beside me with Sam's old rifle in her hand, steady, not because she wanted blood, but because it was her land and her door, and she would be no man's reason to fight that she wasn't willing to stand in herself. And Effie was up at the house with the mercantile man's wife, safe, away from it. Lyle reined up. He looked at the doorway full of his neighbors. He looked at me. "This is the one," Cruz said low. "The drifter. There's word out of Quitman about a regulator went by, and he said a name, the name, my name, the one I'd buried, and the whole street heard it. And I felt it land on me like a brand, 2 years of becoming nobody undone in 2 words." And Lyle's eyes lit up, because he thought he finally understood, thought I was just a worse version of his own men, a gun for the widow, a thing he could meet on terms he knew. "So that's it," Lyle said, and he was grinning now, sure of his ground again. "She hired herself a shootist. Well, we can do it that way." His hand moved toward his coat. "You can," I said, "but I won't." He stopped. "Cruz has the name right," I said to him and to the whole street, because if it was going to come out it would come out true, said by me, not whispered. I was that man. I ran little outfits off land they'd proved up honest for men like you for money. I killed a man in front of his boy doing it, and I threw the gun in the dust 2 years ago, and I have not picked it up since, and I am not picking it up tonight. There's no gun on my hip. There's no gun in this forge but the ones these folks brought to stand by a neighbor, and they'll use them only if you make them, and I think you can see they'd rather not. I took a step out into the yard, into the open, where he could see I carried nothing. You came here to make the truth not matter, Lyle. You're a few days too late and a forged date too sloppy. The judge has seen your paper. Half this town saw Sam dig that spring. Your foreman's just hung your real name on me in front of 9 witnesses, which means everything that happens here tonight gets told true at the county seat. You can ride off this land right now and answer for the forgery like a man and maybe keep your neck. Or you can pull that gun and add a widow's forge full of her neighbors to the ledger in front of all of them and hang for certain. There's your 2 doors. Pick one. But you'll do your picking looking at people, not at an empty street. That's the difference, and it's the whole difference. Enough. I'd said it again. That word. And I understood, standing there barehanded in front of the man I'd once been hired by 100 times, that this was what I'd come all that cold way north to learn, that the bravest thing I'd ever do, braver than any draw, was to stand in a street I knew how to win the old way and refuse to win it that way, and let the truth and the witnesses and the plain stubborn courage of ordinary people do what a gun never could, which is end the thing so it stays ended. Lyle Doyle looked at the doorway full of his neighbors with their plain faces and their borrowed nerve. He looked at his own men, and Boyd Cruz, I watched it happen. Boyd Cruz took his hand off his gun, because Cruz was a hired man and hired men do sums, and the sum here came out hanging, and there's no wage worth that. One by one Lyle's men did the same. And Lyle Doyle, sleek and soft and suddenly alone on his horse in the falling dark, with no silence left to hide in and no town left to look away, did the only thing a coward can do when the weight finally lands on the man who earned it. He turned his horse and he rode off his dead brother's land, and the forgery hung him in court 3 weeks later in front of the circuit judge, not by the neck, the judge being merciful, and the fraud being caught before it cost a life, but ruined, his range sold off to pay what he tried to steal, run out of the country a poorer and smaller man than the brother he'd spent his life resenting. And Boyd Cruz drifted on the way his kind always does, looking for an easier street, and Marshall Pell found his star too heavy after that, and gave it up to a man named Cobb who wore it like he meant it. And the forge stayed Hannah's. The deed held true and clear, the way it had always been. The land went to Effie, the way Sam built it too. The town came back to the fire, ashamed of itself the productive way that makes people kinder afterward, and there was never an empty afternoon at that anvil again. I married Hannah Doyle the next spring, when the bottomland grass came in green a month ahead of the range the way it always did, over the spring Sam found by watching the deer. I want to be careful how I say this part, because it matters. She didn't marry a man who saved her. She told me true that first hard night. She never wanted saving and I never gave it. What she held herself, with her own hammer and her own deed and her own refusal to sign. And all I ever did was stand in a doorway and say one word at the right time so the truth had room to get up off the ground. She kept her land because it was hers and she would not let it go. She married me after because she chose to, with her own clear eyes open on her own ground, no door closing behind her and no weight on the scale, a free woman choosing a worn-down man, which is the only kind of choosing worth a thing. We worked the forge together 30 years. She stayed the better smith to the end, and I stayed glad of it. Effie grew up at that anvil and married a good quiet man, and the land's hers now, green every spring. And there are children on it who know the story of their great-grandfather Sam and the spring and the deer. And they know about the bad year. And they know, because Hannah made sure they'd know, that their grandmother held the line herself, and that the worn old man who married her had once been a hard and shameful thing and had, late and undeserved, learned to be a shield instead. I never picked the gun back up. It's still wrapped in oilcloth somewhere, I suppose, or rusted to nothing by now. I lived out my whole second life barehanded at a fire that wasn't mine until it was, and I'll tell you the thing I learned, the thing I started with. The hardest thing a man can do with a gun is leave it in the holster. I did the easy hard thing my whole young life, the drawing, the winning, the running off. It took a frightened child's hand twisted in my shirt, and a widow too proud to be saved, and a whole town learning to quit looking away to teach me the other thing. The real thing. The thing worth the long, cold ride north to find. That a man isn't measured by what he knows how to do to people. He's measured by what he sets down and stands in front of instead and won't pick back up. Not even when they hand it to him. Not even when it would win. Not even when the worst part of him is aching for the old, clean, simple end of it. Hannah's gone 3 winters now. I'm an old man telling this on the same porch where she once made me eat on the back step. And I've earned my chair by the fire and the right to tell it. And I tell it slow because it's the only thing I've got worth handing on. There's the spring out there in the dusk, and the deer still come to it, the way they did for Sam before me, and the grass comes green a month early, and the forge rings 2 beats and a rest in Effie's husband's hands now, the oldest music there is. She held her own land. I only stood in the door. But standing in that door, barehanded, with that one word in my mouth, that was the first honest day's work of my life, and I have been grateful for it every cold morning since.